We come to a propitious date. This is 1-4-14. As my daughter used to say, these are magic numbers. They pair, but they pair in such a way that there are three rather than just two. This 2014 series is, the title of it is Paryana. And you can put the article "the" in if you like, the Paryana. And the Paryana is something which now is being introduced for the first time, so it is new. It is now new, has begun its emergence today with this presentation. But it also, because of a particular pairing of the future and the new past, it has a recursive quality of going back to the origins of the testimony of an ancient wisdom tradition. And that ancient wisdom tradition happened about 2,500 years ago. And in this particular lead into it, it originates with the historical Buddha. When the historical Buddha, who lived 80 years, when he passed on, one doesn't say he died, but the traditional word for what happened was the parinirvana. The parinirvana was his ascension from the release of the bodily form into his eternal Buddha nature, as it were. And that this Buddha nature is eternal, but has the ability to come into a reincarnation, except that a Buddha does not reincarnate so much, but characterizes a new age, a new time form. And in ancient India, time forms were immense. The Yuga was something like 100 million years, and it is something which is cosmic, has nothing to do with material universes, has everything to do with a cosmos that is pulsing with periodicities, with miracles, with incredible exactitude, and all of this was characterized as there have been previous Buddhas, but this Buddha is not the reincarnation of some previous Buddha, but is a fresh incarnation that has a background, as they say, of enormous lives as various kinds of animals and other kinds of people, who the traditional collection of the tales of the previous lives of the Buddha are collected. They make 3 thick volumes called the Jataka Tales, translated in 6 volumes, 3 volumes of text and 3 volumes of translation by E.B. Cowell in the 19th century, and still in print from the sacred books of the Buddhists. The Jataka Tales are 550 lives when the Buddha was a monkey, when he was a horse, when he was this person, he was that person, male and female, and all of these previous lives had an accumulation of dedication that was built up through travail and through disappointments and through incredible tragedies, catastrophes, beautiful recoveries and emergences, and eventually the historical Buddha became something of a figure of someone who achieved, not under a single Bodhi tree, but under 4 trees, the great banyan tree, the several other kinds of trees, and the 4th one was the Bodhi tree. It's a kind of an Indian fig or ficus tree. His parinirvana occurred in 483 BC, and at the time there was great sorrow. I'll bring in a print perhaps next week of a classic, everyone is weeping, the animals are weeping, everyone is down, the monks are down, and in order to bring that back into its reality, there was a confabulation of all of the members of his Sangha, all of the monks that were with him in that Sangha, in that community, and there were also some nuns, there were many lay persons, and they were brought together near a peak, Vulture Peak, in northern India, but in the southernmost tip of the Buddha's living ambit, from Kusinara and up near where Nepal is, all the way down below the Ganges, near Patna, near Benares, at Rajagriha. And there, in that confab, those who had heard the Buddha recited the remembered sutras. And at this time, there was an enormous quality of excellence that happened. The later development, some 500 years later, almost 600 years later, where the old way, it was called the way of the elders, the Theravada. Vada is a path. The elders' path was the Theravada. And at that time, all of the sutras were remembered. And there were many small sutras, and there were some that were quite tiny. There were some that were beginning to be a little more substantial. And all of them were the short sutras. The Sanskrit word for short is kula. Then there were the middle length sutras, the Majjhima Nikaya, and they were 150, actually 151, but 150, and they were grouped in groups of 10, and 15 of these groups of 10 made up the middle length sayings, as the original translation in the Pali Text Society was by Miss I.B. Horner. And in order to show that the 10 was a set that then had a capacity to have a perfection, a perfect 10, at the end of each 10, that particular short sutra would become something that was like a mnemonic cue that this set is now complete, and if there is another set, it begins as a resonance of this first set. So when one looks at the middle length sayings, the Majjhima Nikaya, a Nikaya is like the ability to have something that is sutra remembered, collected together. And in the 10th of the Majjhima Nikaya, you have the Satipatthana Sutra. And Satipatthana is world famous as the Mindfulness Sutra, that one learns by the presentation, the teaching, almost like an instruction, that this is a vipassana. Actually, the Sanskrit term is vipassana. It is the way of mindfulness. It is the paying of attention continuously. And when one does this continuously, what occurs when you become not just efficient at it, not even further proficient at it, when you are absorbed within it, that continuity obviates the separations of space. And it eventually obviates even the dimension of time, so that there is a continuity of timelessness. And in that continuity of timelessness, anything that occurs spontaneously. It emerges spontaneously and it absorbs spontaneously, so that it can go in and out of existence in such a way that when it emerges into existence, the characteristic of its structure, of its power to be, is that it is at the root paired. So that symmetry is the root of the universe. But the continuity of formlessness is the reality of the cosmos. So it is going in and out of this, and in about 90 AD, because the Theravada had, after 500 years, achieved, according to one of the prophetic predictions of the Buddha, that after 500 years there would come someone to refine everything that had been done. What would the refining be? The refining would be that the nirvana was the perfection of the pairedness, which then in its perfection would be able to, en masse, ensemble, return to formlessness and to reality. And so at that time in India, there was a monumental, which is too small a word. It was epochable, which is also too small a word. There was a change of time form that had occurred and was brought into India from outside. And the messenger of that was St. Thomas. St. Thomas, is identified in the New Testament as Didymus Thomas, the twin. That is to say, he was like a twin to Jesus, not in the sense that they particularly looked alike. In fact, they didn't look alike, but that he was paired in attunement to Jesus in such that one then understood the phrase doubting Thomas is not the doubting of Jesus, but the doubting of the risen Jesus as being parable to him. And he didn't feel the parability to the risen Jesus. And when he discovered that there was a particular newness, that the risen Jesus was in fact an eternal emergence, and that the living Jesus had been someone that one could be paired to, the returned, risen Jesus was only someone that could be shared with. So that pairing is at the deepest quality of the universe and shows itself in symmetries, the predilection for symmetries, and for pairs to pair and become squares, become quaternaries, and for the quaternaries, the squares, to take that inheritance, and two squares can pair together and make an octagonal, an octagonal, an octet, an octave. And so one begins to see that the eights are enormously important as a structure of paired squares of attention. That the attentiveness that is there in vipassana, in the vipassana, in the way of mindfulness, that mindfulness becomes full even to the extent that it is absorbed in the mind's absorption into the real. And while pairedness is the core of what has emerged into existence, positive and negative, proton and electron, etc., there are qualities of formlessness that are real. And their reality, is not discernible in the universe at all, because it doesn't have a pairedness. It has, in lieu of pairedness, sharedness. So that the shared quality of presence is, as we would say in a paired universe, the characteristic of reality. And the reality of the risen Jesus was able to spontaneously share with Thomas and many of the others who were there, so that they became in shared presence with that eternal quality. And Thomas took that to India, and he took it to 3 different places in India. The first was in South India, what is Kerala province today. And it was where the ancient trade routes from Egypt contacted because of the pre-monsoon wind season that allowed one to sail from the Yemen-Ethiopian coast, Yemen-Somalia coast, from Socotra Island that is there at the mouth of the Red Sea as it opens up. The first person to take advantage of those sailing conditions that led directly to the South India tip, to where Kerala is, that Malabar coast, was Queen Hatshepsut, about 1500 BC in Egypt. And she was the genius behind the ability to have the Egyptian, Indian, ancient connection of civilizations that awoke Egypt and awoke India to understand that there were sophisticated human beings, men and women, of long civilized extent, who were able to come into an interface together. And the first, after the initial voyage that proved that this was the way, Queen Hatshepsut, because she was really regal, she amassed a fleet of 60 ships, and every year then at the pre-monsoon season, she would send 60 ships in a fleet from Egypt at that time extended down to Nubia, which was Egypt, and over into Yemen, and that was the ancient Sheba. And so the Queen of Sheba, 500 years after Hatshepsut, carried on the African-India relationship. And it went 2 ways, so that you would find in Ethiopia and in Yemen, in Sheba, there was a mixing of races, so that one had the Indian Africans and the Ethiopians today, the Yemenis today, have that, not a biracial quality, but a kaleidoscopic racial quality, because there are many kinds of Egyptians, many kinds of Indians. And so you had this meeting of a new quality of mankind, a new quality of humanity that emerged. in this way, Thomas landed at Kerala. Then, because the invitation, a written invitation, had come from a great king in the northern part, what is today Kashmir, what in ancient times was called Gandhara. And the Gandhara area was a recipient of many of the Greek foundations in India laid by originally Alexander the Great, but patterned on some of the early foundations laid by Cyrus the Great from Iran, from ancient Persia, really more Persia at the time than Iran. Irani is a collection of many tribes. The Persians were the ones who conquered the previous powerful tribe, the Medes, and the Persian tribe became the leadership under Cyrus the Great. And he's the first one to remember that the ancient, most ancient Semitic trade routes were those of Sargon of Akkad, about 2300 BC, some 1800 years before Cyrus, some 2,000 years before Alexander the Great, that his trading empire, because of the Semitic, North Semitic quality of being able to master many kinds of languages, not just 1, 2, and 3, dozens of languages, dozens of different qualities of culture, and to not mulch them together, but to string them like beads together on a common continuity, which was the benefit that all received from an expanded trade, and that the tone of keeping that thread of trade between hundreds of kingdoms and scores of languages, dozens of cultures, Sargon was able to show that there was a common denominator of the deeper meaning if one translated the oral spoken languages into their written forms. And so the written forms of language that began to really consolidate as something that was readable and writable became the foundation of Sargon's empire, and the genius behind that ability to use language on that scale first was Enheduanna, his prized daughter, the high priestess of the consolidation of all the Sumerian temple cities, 42 of them, together with a common thread, a common continuity, that the common denominator of all of them was a new realization now that there was a written, readable language that all could share. If you could read in any language, you could learn to read in another language. If you could write in any language, you could learn to write in any language. And so it was the common denominator of writable, readable language that eventually refined itself some 300 years later as that there were alphabetical, written, readable, writable languages that no longer needed hundreds or thousands of pictographs or odd cuneiform shapes that were almost impossible to distinguish. Now the alphabetical languages of about 2000 BC gave the ability to have certain qualities of language that became almost universal, and were able to spread and displace many of the different kinds of oral languages, not in daily business, not in daily life. People still talk the way that they used to talk with each other, but in the literate populations of men and women, because they could read and they could write. They could learn to read and write someone else's language and understand, as a native then of that culture, how these intercultural qualities accrued and added up, like the many previous lives of the Buddha added finally to the emergence of a historical Buddha. That there was a quality, that one could come into play, and that one could learn not only to read and write an alphabetical language, but eventually that there were meanings. There was meaningfulness in between the lines. And it refined so that there was meaning and meaningfulness in between the words in the lines. And so a poetic of written, readable language became not something that was just remembered in a mnemonic as an instruction, but the poetic became something that was spontaneous, that came out of the pre-time limitations, the pre-space pairings, the quality that distinguished individual existence as such, and gave over the quality that one who did this had an identity, had an individuality. All of this then evaporated and melted into what could evaporate, and evaporated into what was formless and thus was real. And so this quality, about 500 years after the historical Buddha, from the risen Jesus and his shared presence with Mary Magdalene, was conveyed through St. Thomas in his shared presence, and he went to northern India, King Gondophares, who asked him to build a palace to show the population of his kingdom, which was quite powerful at the time. Gandhara was easily the same level as Egypt under Alexandria, or the Persian Empire under Antiochus. It was a major place of civilization in the world. Instead of building a physical palace, while Gondophares was out on a year's military campaigns, and when he came back, there was no palace and all the money was spent. What did you do with this royal treasure, this treasury? And Thomas said, I have distributed it to all of the people in your kingdom, and they all love you. Of course, Gondophares said, and put him into prison. But as he came to understand what had happened, the sea change of his kingdom was that everything was working beautifully. Everyone cared for each other, took care, and he began to realize that St. Thomas had built as close to a shared presence community population of his kingdom as could be possible. And so the successor who out-militarized Gondophares in Central Asia, his name was Kanishka, when he came in and took over the St. Thomistic Gondophares Gandhara, he recognized that the true root of what had happened was St. Thomas, who had passed on the baton, as it were, to a man in Gandhara named Parshva, and Parshva was giving instruction that the most outstanding critic of what was becoming the Mahayana, the Great Way, Jesus in his teachings as a living teaches taught the way. The risen Jesus taught the Great Way. And in India, when Thomas brought it through Parshva into the Mahayana, the Great Way, which was taking the historical Buddha 500 years ago, now was refined into a kaleidoscopic arrayed necklace, a garland of differential, conscious, kaleidoscopically historic, real persons that they then began to develop the Mahayana, the Great Way. And Parshva took the greatest critic of this. His name was Ashvaghosha. Asva in Sanskrit is horse. Gosha is the sound that a whinnying horse makes, the neighing of the horse. And so the neighing of the horse is a sign of the triumphant one, the real power, the real root. It is the triumphant horse that is the carrier of the power in that age that came with the introduction. Sargon used something as a physical monetary currency in his trading empire from Cyprus to the Indus River. And the trading item that was valuable everywhere was tin. We think of tin as like, oh, tin soldier, a tin badge. But a little bit of tin goes a long way. Because when you add a little bit of tin to copper, instead of having copper, which produced the Chalcolithic age, you now had bronze. And the Bronze Age was something. A copper sword wasn't much use in battle, but a bronze sword took an edge and you could cleave the shields, you could cleave your way. It was the real power. And so the Bronze Age that came in with Sargon seeding it, and then came in about the time that written language came in, and 1,000 years later it had matured about 1000 BC to the age of Homer and to the age of King David, that they were contemporaries, and they were the inheritors of the power of the Bronze Age. But they were inheritors also that there was a feminine wisdom that went with the improved means that masculinity had, and that the increased wisdom of the feminine could pair with the increased means of penetration that men had developed. And together that pairing could be tunable, and be tunable until it was not unified, but until it produced a whole spectrum. And the first indication that there was a new spectrum was the five-pointed star. And it was the star that was the seed of the visionary fifth quintessential dimension that had come into play, that of differential consciousness, the thumb on the hand. And with differential consciousness as the quintessential, the whole octave now became an ability to develop something which is extraordinary. It began to have a third level. The star, the octave, ogdoad, octagonal, eightfold path, eightfold almost anything, into the real that was spontaneous through its shareability, and that the continuity of it meant that it was shareable not only now and then and there, but shareable with anyone who had ever been shareable before or will be shareable in the future, so that you had an infinite community. We're going to take a little break, and we're going to come back to Parshva's conversion of Ashvaghosha to the Mahayana. And for the first time in India, there was a written manuscript that used the term faith. In Sanskrit, faith is Shraddha. The awakening of faith in the Mahayana is one of the great classics of world literature. It is the birth of the Mahayana into a written, readable, learnable reality, which now is being put into yet another refinement, here and now, indefinitely, the Paryana. Let's take a break.